The nurse said it was normal, but I didn't expect it would make my heart race. The first time I stepped into the clinic, my chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with my health. The walls were pale, almost sterile, the faint antiseptic scent mingling with the faint aroma of polished wood from the reception desk. I could hear the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the quiet shuffle of papers as the receptionist organized files. My hands were clammy, and I kept adjusting the sleeves of my shirt, trying to appear casual, though I knew I must look awkward. She entered the room like she had always belonged there, a presence that somehow filled the space without needing to announce herself. She was older than me, undeniably so, but there was a grace about her that made her appear at once confident and approachable. Her hair, streaked with silver in the most natural way, framed a face that held quiet strength, yet there was a softness in her eyes that immediately put me slightly at ease. She smiled, a subtle, knowing curve of her lips, and for the first time since stepping in, I felt a flutter of calm amid the nervous tension in my chest. As she moved to prepare the equipment, I noticed the gentle fluidity in her movements, how her fingers brushed lightly over instruments, setting them down with care. The small gestures, the tilt of her head, the quiet rhythm of her steps, conveyed competence and empathy all at once. I wanted to trust her, though a part of me resisted, embarrassed by the vulnerability of being here. My thoughts flickered uncomfortably, she's just doing her job. Nothing more. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't help noticing the way her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary when she explained the procedure. She spoke softly, each word measured and calm, yet underneath that professionalism, I sensed an intuitive awareness of my unease. I tried to focus on her instructions, on the mechanics of what was to come, but the warmth in her tone and the subtle steadiness of her gaze made it almost impossible not to notice how different she felt from everyone else I had met in these sterile corridors. When she reached out to adjust the equipment near me, her hand briefly touched my shoulder. The warmth surprised me. It was grounding, brief, but enough to send a ripple through me, a mix of embarrassment, curiosity, and something I couldn't quite name. That fleeting contact, combined with the soft cadence of her voice, made my nerves settle slightly, even as a new, quiet tension began to weave itself into the room. It wasn't fear or discomfort. It was something else, a cautious intrigue, a hint of connection I wasn't expecting from a place designed to be clinical, impersonal, and efficient. By the time she finished the initial explanation, I realized I was both relieved and uncomfortably aware of the way my chest had tightened and loosened in rhythm with her movements, as if her presence alone could dictate the pace of my heartbeat. And in that moment, I understood that this appointment, ordinary on the surface, would mark the beginning of something far more intricate than a simple checkup. She noticed my hands trembling slightly as I tried to settle onto the examination chair. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, but she didn't let me off with that. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her presence deliberate yet unassuming, and her voice was softer now, carrying a warmth that contrasted with the sterile chill of the clinic. "It's okay," she said, just once, but the words seemed to reach deeper than any explanation of the procedure could. Her hands moved with quiet precision as she prepared the equipment, but every now and then, they lingered near me longer than strictly necessary. When she adjusted the positioning of my arm, her fingers brushed mine lightly. The contact was brief, almost incidental, yet the warmth and steadiness behind it sent a shiver through me, not of discomfort, but of something unanticipated. My mind struggled to reconcile the professional setting with the strange comfort her touch offered. I tried to focus on the instructions, on the steps of the checkup, but her calmness was contagious. There was an understated grace in her gestures, the tilt of her head as she asked a question, the way she straightened the medical instruments with delicate care, the faint smile that curved her lips when she noticed my hesitance. Each small detail made the room feel less clinical and more personal, almost intimate in the most unexpected way. At one point, she guided me to adjust my position on the chair, and her hand brushed against my shoulder. The contact was so light, so fleeting, yet it felt grounding, as though she were silently telling me it was all right to feel nervous, to be vulnerable. I caught myself studying the way her eyes held mine, not with judgment, but with a steady, reassuring curiosity. It was the kind of attention that made me aware of every subtle movement, every slight quiver in my own posture. I realized, almost reluctantly, that her presence was settling something in me I hadn't anticipated. The anxiety that had knotted my chest earlier softened, replaced by a strange awareness of how different her touch and gaze were from anyone else I had ever encountered. There was a tension there, yes, but it was tempered with warmth, a delicate, unspoken acknowledgement that even in a place designed for procedure and routine, human connection could exist. By the time she finished preparing, I felt a quiet steadiness I hadn't expected when I walked in. My pulse was still slightly elevated, not from fear, but from the subtle intimacy of proximity, of shared awareness, of the unspoken comfort she offered without words. In that moment, I began to understand that this wasn't just a routine appointment. It was the beginning of an emotional journey I wasn't yet ready to name, a gentle, lingering pull towards someone who seemed impossibly out of reach yet strangely close at the same time. The moment arrived when the procedure began, and I could feel the tension in my chest tighten again. My palms were damp, and I forced myself to focus on the neutral, mechanical instructions she gave, but despite my best efforts, my body betrayed me. A sudden, involuntary sound escaped me, more audible than I ever intended. My cheeks burned, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the antiseptic-scented floor. Instead of reprimanding me or showing any sign of judgment, she chuckled lightly. It was the kind of laugh that was warm, quiet, and surprisingly comforting, not mocking at all. Her eyes met mine, sparkling with a mix of understanding and gentle amusement, and for a moment I forgot the procedure entirely. The awkwardness of my reaction lingered, but it no longer felt like something to be ashamed of. Her humor dissolved the tension in the room like sunlight through a crack in the blinds, and I realized that vulnerability wasn't something to hide, it could be shared, even in small, seemingly ridiculous ways. Her hands moved with care, adjusting straps or positioning instruments, and each subtle touch was grounding. The brush of her fingers on my arm, the soft guidance of her hand as she steadied me, created a strange paradox. I was painfully aware of my embarrassment, yet the physical comfort she offered made it bearable, even soothing. The warmth of her touch contrasted sharply with the cool, clinical metal around us, and I found myself watching the way her hair fell softly over her shoulder as she leaned in to check the equipment. Each small movement carried a quiet grace that seemed almost deliberate, though I knew it was simply the ease of her experience. I tried to focus on the procedure again, but the tension didn't leave entirely. It had transformed, though, from discomfort into something else, a heightened awareness of her presence, a subtle, almost unnoticeable thrill at the closeness between us. Every glance, every small smile she offered in response to my nervousness, drew me in further. The clinical setting had become charged with something intimate, something that had nothing to do with the procedure itself. By the time she finished that part of the process, I felt a mixture of relief and strange longing. The embarrassment had not vanished entirely, but it was softened by her presence, by the warmth of her touch, and by the way she had handled my vulnerability with such gentle humor. I realized then that this connection, unexpected, unspoken, yet profoundly present, was shaping into something that went beyond mere professionalism. Something in me wanted to linger, to experience the quiet steadiness of her presence for just a little longer. Even in that brief encounter, I could sense the beginning of a bond that promised more than I could yet name, a bond built on trust, subtle affection, and the rare kind of understanding that only comes when someone sees you at your most human, and doesn't look away. After the initial tension of the procedure, a quiet calm settled over the room. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant shuffle of the receptionist faded into the background, leaving just the two of us in that small, softly lit space. It was a pause, almost accidental, but it invited something deeper. I found myself speaking before I even realized it, small admissions about my anxiety, about the stress that had been pressing down on me for weeks, the way life felt heavier than I wanted to admit. She didn't interrupt or offer platitudes. Instead, she listened. Her eyes held mine, steady and unflinching, and in them I sensed genuine attention, the kind that made a person feel safe to be completely vulnerable. The way she leaned slightly forward, resting a hand lightly on the edge of the examination table, was subtle, but it carried weight. I could feel a quiet steadiness in her presence, a grounding force that allowed me to lower walls I hadn't known were so high. Her hand shifted, brushing briefly against mine, not in a deliberate gesture, but in a way that felt unspokenly supportive. The warmth of her skin and the slight pressure of her touch sent an unexpected ripple through me. I wasn't embarrassed anymore. Instead, I felt understood, seen in a way that felt rare and intimate. Her calm, gentle voice encouraged me to continue, each word soft yet steady, as though the world outside the clinic didn't exist in that moment. The emotional intimacy of that exchange was overwhelming in its quietness. I was struck by the contrast between her professional composure and the warmth she conveyed without words. Every subtle movement, how she tilted her head, the way her eyes softened when I stumbled over a confession, the way her hand lingered just a fraction longer, made it impossible not to notice the human connection unfolding between us. I realized then that the procedure itself, the clinical environment, was almost secondary. What mattered was this space of shared vulnerability, the understanding that grew in silence as much as in words. The nurse's presence was steady, unwavering, yet somehow tender. It was a delicate balance. She maintained her professionalism, but allowed just enough warmth and closeness to make the world feel smaller, safer, more intimate. By the time the moment passed, I felt a shift within myself. Anxiety had softened, replaced by a strange, buoyant sense of trust. I was aware of her proximity, of the subtle electricity in the brief contact of her hand, and of the depth of attention she had given me. Something unspoken had passed between us, a fragile, unacknowledged understanding that this connection, born from honesty and vulnerability, could quietly grow into something meaningful, something neither of us could yet name, but both could feel. The procedure had officially ended, yet neither of us seemed eager to break the quiet connection that had formed. She helped me to my feet, her hands lightly guiding my elbows as I steadied myself. It was such a small gesture, so natural in its simplicity, yet the warmth of her touch lingered far longer than the brief contact demanded. I noticed the way her fingers brushed against mine, a fleeting but deliberate reassurance, and the subtle shift in her stance that mirrored my own hesitation to let go of the moment. I couldn't help but be aware of every detail about her, the gentle sway of her hair as she moved, the softness in her eyes, the faint scent of her perfume that seemed to wrap around me, comforting and strangely intimate. The clinical atmosphere faded into the background, the sounds of the clinic, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint beeping of monitors, felt distant, almost irrelevant. In its place was the quiet intimacy of proximity, the unspoken acknowledgement that we were sharing something personal, something delicate. When she guided me toward the door, her hand lingered for an extra heartbeat on my arm. It wasn't professional necessity, it was something else, something that made me acutely aware of the closeness between us. The warmth of her skin, the careful steadiness of her grip, seemed to communicate reassurance and attentiveness without a single word. My chest tightened in a mix of nervousness and anticipation, yet the sensation was comforting rather than overwhelming. I found myself stealing glances at her as she moved with effortless grace, noting the quiet confidence in her posture and the way her smile could shift the atmosphere from clinical to personal with ease. The subtle affection in her gestures, the light touch guiding my elbow, the patient attentiveness as she ensured I was steady, was more powerful than any grand display of emotion. It spoke of care, respect, and a connection that was slowly, steadily building between us. By the time I reached the door, I realized that this wasn't simply a nurse-patient interaction anymore. The experience had created a bridge between us, delicate but undeniable. The contact had left an imprint on my awareness, the lingering warmth of her hand, the echo of her soft guidance, and the unspoken reassurance in her eyes. Every small gesture carried weight, and every glance hinted at an unacknowledged, shared understanding. I stepped out of the room with a strange mixture of relief and lingering desire to stay, to experience just a little longer the quiet steadiness of her presence. The boundaries of professionalism were intact, but the emotional intimacy had shifted. I knew, without a doubt, that this connection, born of subtle touches, shared vulnerability, and quiet attentiveness, was growing. And though neither of us would name it yet, I felt the unmistakable pull of something slow, profound, and entirely unexpected. By the time I stepped toward the clinic's exit, the residual warmth of her presence lingered like a soft glow. She didn't rush me, didn't retreat behind the strict professionalism that might have been expected. Instead, she paused, her hand hovering near the doorframe, almost as if she were offering me permission to linger in the quiet, shared space one last moment. The faint scent of her perfume, subtle yet undeniably there, mixed with the antiseptic in the air, grounding me in a way that made leaving feel almost reluctant. Her eyes met mine, steady and attentive, and I noticed for the first time how much unspoken understanding had passed between us. Every subtle smile, every fractional shift of posture, carried meaning without words. The soft warmth in her gaze suggested recognition of my nervous energy, of the vulnerability I had tried to hide, and even more than that, it hinted at a quiet curiosity, a willingness to meet me in this delicate, shared intimacy. I lingered near the doorway, suddenly hyper-aware of the small gestures I had once thought inconsequential. The brush of her fingers against mine while guiding me, the patient steadiness in her touch, the way she had leaned slightly closer to explain instructions, these were no longer just professional interactions. They were intimate exchanges in miniature, fleeting and gentle, yet powerful in the way they made me feel seen and understood. The room seemed to shrink around us, leaving only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet rhythm of our breaths. I felt my chest tighten, not from anxiety, but from the awareness of closeness, of a bond forming in silence. For a moment, I wanted to reach out, to prolong this subtle connection, but I also understood the fragility of the moment. It wasn't about words or grand gestures, it was about presence, attentiveness, and the unspoken acknowledgement of trust. When she finally stepped back, just a little, it was almost imperceptible, yet I felt the emotional weight of the gesture. There was a pause, a fraction of a second where the world felt suspended. I realized then that this bond, built from careful touches, steady gazes, and shared vulnerability, had grown into something deeply personal, something I couldn't quite name but felt with clarity in my chest. As I walked away from the clinic, the memory of her hand lingering on mine, the warmth in her eyes, and the gentle steadiness of her presence remained with me. It was an intimacy born not from words, but from attention, patience, and care, a quiet connection that had transformed a routine appointment into an experience I would remember far longer than the procedure itself. And in that lingering space between us, I understood that this was only the beginning of something profound, tender, and entirely unexpected. The follow-up appointment arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. I walked into the clinic and felt none of the nervous tension that had gripped me the first time. The antiseptic scent and quiet hum of fluorescent lights were still there, but they felt almost familiar now, like the backdrop to something meaningful rather than sterile and intimidating. And there she was, her presence immediately grounding, the same gentle warmth in her eyes that had quietly eased my nerves weeks before. This time, the routine of the procedure felt secondary. The true significance of my visit lay in the connection we had built, a bond born from small gestures, subtle touches, and the patient attentiveness she had shown from the very beginning. She greeted me with a soft smile that carried recognition, not just of me as a patient, but of the trust and openness I had offered in return. The simple act of her nodding as I entered made me feel seen, acknowledged, and strangely understood in a way that extended beyond the confines of the clinic. As she guided me through the follow-up, her hands brushed against mine again, not just in professional necessity, but in a deliberate, gentle affirmation of closeness. The warmth of her skin, the subtle steadiness in her touch, conveyed reassurance and care that went deeper than words could ever express. I found myself acutely aware of her presence, of the subtle grace in her movements, the faint fragrance that clung softly to the air around her, and the way her eyes seemed to hold me in quiet, unspoken understanding. We spoke more this time, not just about the procedure, but about life in small, tentative ways, observations, shared laughter, gentle confessions. Each word was measured, yet carried a warmth that made the clinical space feel unexpectedly intimate. The boundaries of professionalism remained intact, yet the emotional intimacy between us had evolved into something tender, personal, and undeniably human. When the visit concluded, she lingered at the door, our eyes meeting one last time. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic statements, her smile, the brief, comforting brush of her hand against mine, and the steady warmth of her gaze said everything. I felt a quiet ache of anticipation, a desire to prolong the moment, tempered by respect for the boundaries we had navigated so carefully. Walking away, I carried with me a sense of resolution and profound connection. The nervousness and embarrassment of that first visit had transformed into trust, admiration, and a subtle, enduring affection. The experience had taught me that intimacy could exist in the smallest gestures, that connection could grow quietly, and that love, or at least the tender beginnings of it, did not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes, it lingered in a hand on your arm, a steady gaze, a shared moment of understanding. And in that quiet, slow-burn way, I realized that what had begun as a routine appointment had blossomed into something far more extraordinary, a bond one would cherish long after the clinic doors closed behind me. Did their quiet connection change everything? Watch the full story to experience every subtle moment and gentle glance, link in the description.